This week on Forward, CNN anchor and author of the new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, John Avlon. John Avlon's on Forward this week. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast the author of the tremendous book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, one of the most independent journalists that's out there. A friend of mine from CNN, John Avlon. Welcome, John.
Thanks, man. Andrew, it's good to see you. As always, you and I do have kind of a mind meld on politics. So I know we're going to have fun on this one.
Yeah, you are maybe one of the most dyed-in-the-wool, capital I, independents that I know, where you've actually been ahead of everyone, including me, on the democracy reform train. How the heck did you get there before the rest of us?
I mean, I appreciate that. I don't know that I can take all the credit, but I you know, your kind words, I'm not sure I deserve them, I guess what I'm saying. But I did write, my first book was called Independent Nation, How the Vital Center Can Change American Politics, which was published in 2004 when I was, I think I just turned 30. But it always seemed common sense to me that when you study American history and you study the presidents, as I did and loved doing so as a young child, that their parties faded away. The party label didn't matter. What mattered were their ability to unite and confront the challenges of the time, and that necessarily, in the pendulum swing of American politics, as used to be, it necessarily didn't follow the pattern of any one political party. And even then, things were getting more and more extreme. Party polarization in Congress, you saw really hit overdrive after 1994 with the Republican Revolution. And Bill Clinton recentered the Democrats after the Democrats lost 3 consecutive elections by 40 states. Bill Clinton moved the Democratic Party to the center and was able to win back the White House. And it just seemed to me very obviously that if you seize the center, if you try to realign politics, if you don't focus on playing to the base, that's where most American people are. But there's a huge disconnect between where the politicians are and where the most activist base is, and where the heart and soul of the country is. And then what we saw over recent decades, this attempt, and you and I have discussed this, and this is chapter and verse for you, this attempt to rig the system to perpetuate this false notion that America is ideologically polarized. And so they do it through the rigged system of redistricting and closed partisan primaries and all the things that you've been hammering out on to basically move power to the extremes of our politics. And so you reap what you sow. And so we have a politics that ends up denigrating our democracy by giving people false choices. And I want to be clear, right now we have asymmetric polarization. The Republican Party is far more further to the right than the Democratic Party is further to the left. So this is not a both-siderism critique, but that dynamic ends up running down our democracy by perpetuating division, dysfunction, and then a kind of cynicism that makes some people think there's no functional difference between democracy and other forms of government, although I think they've gotten a reality check, so to speak, in recent weeks about the fundamental differences.
So you've been a student of history since way back, if you were writing about the stuff in essentially your 20s. Is it somehow an accident that you ended up marrying the descendant of one of the presidents? Or were you like screening when you were dating, being like, are you the descendant of a U.S. president? Check.
No, that would be so creepy and sociopathic. And for all my many faults, I don't think that's one of them. No, I think it was probably an added point of interest. Although it's fair to say that I was not a student of Herbert Hoover or had a particularly sympathetic view of him before I met Margaret, and I learned a lot actually about what an extraordinary American he was, and that's not only because I'm married to Margaret. No, that was a happy coincidence. I think if you look at the qualities I was looking for at the time, rooted in her personality, having absolutely nothing to do with her last name, you would have seen really quickly that she is my type in every way, shape, or form. And neither, by the way, given the fact that she was a Republican and conservative, it was actually an issue. And we've talked about this. the fact that I was an independent was a real challenge for her and her family.
No,
there
I
was an
did not know
assumption that,
that. That's interesting.
yeah, that there's an assumption. I mean, party identity had sort of not supplanted the role of religion, but had an almost religious quality, particularly in that family, and somewhat honestly earned, given the scar tissue they had because of the partisan fights. Although, ironically, Herbert Hoover, when he was elected, described himself as an independent progressive in the Republican tradition, which I love, and I remind my father-in-law of whenever I can. But yeah, so even that was a hurdle in our courtship, so to speak.
Wow, fascinating. Well, for those of you who don't know, John's married to Margaret Hoover, who's an awesome journalist in her own right. And both John and Margaret were some of the most generous journalists when I was running for office, where they brought me on just to talk about the ideas I was running on as opposed to the usual stuff. So was always very grateful to both you and Margaret. And like having been on Margaret's program, I actually would have no inkling as to what her political self-identification is, which I think is how a lot of people would like to
Yeah.
interact with people. So hats off to both of you on that. Reading this book was fascinating and engrossing. And it made me think, as someone who's written a book or two, this book seems extraordinarily hard to write in the sense that you're like recreating historical scenes. It's like, Lincoln and his son Tad walking through this town. I'm like, how the heck does one go about even getting all the primary material to write a book like this?
Well, I mean, first off, you write it because you love it, and it's a different pace from what you do day to day. I mean, I began as a speechwriter, then I was a columnist, then I became editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, which is when I met you, and now as an anchor and analyst. Writing a book, particularly a history book, is a different speed. It and in the case of the opening of the book, which is Lincoln's walk into Richmond, 2 days after the capital of the Confederacy fell, holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday, I actually took my son and we recreated the walk up from the river to the top of Capitol Hill. Yeah.
Wow.
And you're able to get a sense of bearings. And there's a remarkable park ranger there named Michael Gorman, who wrote a 90-page essay about Lincoln and Richmond that debunked a lot of myths, and did the walk with him and learned from him, and toured the Confederate White House, Jefferson Davis's Capitol home, and where Lincoln sat and where he met everybody on that day. So, there's primary research, and then sometimes there's physical research, which I love. But a column or reality check will take me 4 or 5 hours to write. This took me just over 4 years to write. But you want to get the music right.
There was a lot of painstaking detail, and I just imagine you being like surrounded by various documents and manuscripts.
I'll send you. I've got pictures. I mean, one point, my son Jack is reading a tiny little sort of kid's book on Abraham Lincoln, and then behind him are 2 tall stacks of books about Abraham Lincoln. And I mean the research and the research is part of the fun, to the extent where, I don't know if you ever have this experience where you think you're writing when you're doing the research, and then you realize that you really don't start writing until you actually start writing. It's necessary to kind of get the ideas.
You can convince yourself you're doing all sorts of things when you're preparing to write, my friend. Like,
yeah, that's true, man. It's true.
So you started this book years ago, but I have to say it seemed very, very relevant to today. And I think the thing that was stunning to me, was that Abraham Lincoln was essentially a third-party candidate. Mm-hmm. He was kind of a nobody up to that point. He was like a former one-term member of Congress, rattling around the Midwest. And then there is this new startup party called the Republican Party that just kind of comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
and he wins a 4-way race.
Yeah.
With 39.8% of the vote. And just as someone, grows up in this country venerating Abraham Lincoln. Like I was like, what?
No, I totally understand why you would gravitate to that part. And I actually originally that section was 2 or 3 times as long because I got into like the real like electoral mechanics of how the Whig Party was supplanted by the Republican Party. Which you're right, it's the most successful third party in American history, and there's a lot to learn from it. People think that it's important to remember for folks that our Constitution doesn't mention political parties. It does mention journalists, I like to point out, but it doesn't mention political parties. And that's because the Founding Fathers, which was my last book, is about Washington's farewell. He was an independent as a matter of principle. The Founding Fathers expected that members of Congress would represent their conscience and their constituents, but not through the filter of party. Eventually, within their lifetime, they realized that was perhaps inevitable. But the Federalist Party is supplanted by the Whig Party, which then falls apart because it fails to take a stand on slavery that's distinct and clear, the defining issue of the time. Then there's an anti-immigrant know-nothing party that emerges that Lincoln refuses to join, although it's the first nativist party that is very resonant today. And then the way the Republican Party is created and how quickly it rises, it's a big tent, moderate, progressive party dedicated to opposing slavery. Some people oppose its expansion. Some people want complete abolition. And it really ends up seating the states of the fastest growing areas, the upper Midwest and the Northeast. And Lincoln, after losing his Senate race, but his speeches against slavery and slavery's expansion were so powerful that he developed a national reputation, is sort of this young, fresh-faced compromise candidate. He's the moderate from the Midwest, and he has a reputation for honesty. And he's not seen as a radical. As I say, he's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. And that rockets him up to lead the nation at the start of the Civil War without any executive experience and no military experience, and 1 term in Congress. And he succeeds because of his character and because of his capacity to grow. And it's a reminder that, the study of history, shows very clearly, I think, that character is the single most important quality in a president, bar none.
Most successful third party indeed. So the Republican Party starts out as a northern anti-slave party, which is not the way most people think of it today. I mean, it's kind of reversed roles in terms of dominating 100%. The South, thanks to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. So Lincoln becomes president, and that almost immediately kicks off the Civil War in essence, because there were candidates who were vying for votes in the South, neither of whom was Abraham Lincoln. And then when Lincoln won with essentially exclusively Northern support, then the South decides to secede shortly thereafter, and Lincoln finds himself a wartime president with, as you described, very limited experience in that realm.
Yeah, and he wins actually the states in the Pacific, California, Oregon, and I believe Washington at that point. Certainly California and Oregon, but they have they have incredibly small populations. But you're right. It's the energy in the country was in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, and that's what he wins. And Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in the Deep South. And what you see also is that the planter class, the slave owners who were pushing secession, never dared initially bring it to a popular vote in the states. They tried to do it in closed partisan conventions. And then they relied on essentially the violence, beginning with the focus on Fort Sumter. That feeling, they knew the feeling of resentment and revenge would create its own kind of remorseless logic. And people thought, well, we'll just have a quick war and get this over with. But of course, that's not what happened. And Lincoln, who really is a man of peace in a time of war, is the least likely guy. But he studies quickly, he develops a theory of war, and he relies on his interpersonal absence of malice. The defining characteristics I see, he's temperamentally a moderate man, but he combines moderation with moral courage. And I think that's something that you and I share and focus on is that's the magic combination that too often is missing. Too many people look at moderates and see an absence of moral courage, and too many people with moral courage assume a sense of moral superiority. And that's not the way to persuade people. Democracy depends on persuasion. And even in the middle of a civil war, what's so extraordinary is that Lincoln still believes that there's more that unites us than divides us. He refuses to demonize people he disagreed with,
yes,
even when they're calling for his death. He believes that you empathize with your opponents as a means of reasoning with them. It's the politics of the golden rule. And I think it's so inspiring. And it was unusual in his time, too. Don't get me wrong. But it's the reason he's on a higher level than any president or any American political figure.
Yeah, this is a quote that I feel like everyone should take to heart. There's so many Lincoln quotes in this book that I was reminded of. But here's one that spoke to me. If you would win a man to your cause, first convince him you are his sincere friend. But mark him as one to be shamed and despised. He will retreat within himself, close all avenues to his head and his heart. And I think that's totally true.
Yeah, it's totally true.
And it seems like that's a fundamental lesson that everyone just is completely ignored nowadays.
Well, it is. And this is something that you get grief for sometimes in a good faith attempt to reach out and empathize with people and hear where they're coming from. And in the current environment, that basic quality of empathy, let's be honest, has been strained. It's difficult in environments, where people are believing a self-evident big lie pushed by a con man who tried to overturn an election. That's going to strain our capacity for empathy when you see people doubling down on that. But if Lincoln could continue with that spirit of empathy, even in the middle of a civil war, when he would not demonize people he disagrees with, in public or private, that's a tall order. That's a big example. But it really is incumbent upon us to try. We may miss that mark, but it really is incumbent upon us to try, because that's how we get out of this ultimately. Every knowledge of human nature would suggest that, and all the emotional reflexes in politics are set up the other way. But we're going to need to find a way to transcend that, to reconcile again. And so I know that you understand that dynamic.
Oh, he literally had people threatening his life, and he would say, it's okay. Like we'd be doing the same thing in their shoes. I thought that was just an incredible attitude.
Yeah, it's remarkable, especially when you see how he combines opposites. And he does, he personally swings between tragedy and comedy and depression and this sort of tendency to tell jokes all the time, which is really a form of self-medication for him, but which leads other people, his contemporaries, to accuse him of being insufficiently serious. There's that story early in the book where, after a brutal Union defeat, his friend Isaac N. Arnold, the congressman from Illinois, goes to visit him in the White House. And he's sitting on the second floor in front of a fireplace, and he's reading from a book of his favorite humorist, Artemus N. Ward. And Ward, like another of his favorites, Petroleum V. Nasby, play characters. It's actually it's satire. It's first-person satire in the kind of way that the original Stephen Colbert show did, where they're playing a character. Anyway, Arnold sees him laughing by the fireplace after this brutal Union defeat, and he's furious at his friend. He says, "What the hell are you doing? How can you laugh at a time like this?" And then in Arnold's memoir, he describes Lincoln as throwing down the book and turning to him with tears in his eyes and saying, "Do you not realize that if I could not find some way to get relief, that my heart would break?" And that's when he realized that the laughter and the storytelling and the joking was a form of self-medication, which I think is profound.
He bore an unbelievable burden. And one of the themes, maybe the predominant theme in the book, is that he thought you needed to lead a hard war and then follow with a very soft peace. And for a man who is not naturally himself militaristic, to be leading a hard war just seemed like an extraordinarily difficult burden to bear. One of the things that also blew my mind was the war drags on for 4 years, and then the next election is up, 1864. And people are saying to him, it's like, hey, you don't need to have this election because, guess what? There's a war on. And he insists on having the election. But there is a period during which he's not favored to win.
Oh, he's convinced he's going to lose. In August, before the election, he circulates a letter that he has written himself predicting his defeat, closes the envelope, seals it, has his cabinet sign it. And it's literally to be witness to his own silent prediction of his defeat. And then, of course, things change. Importantly, Sherman takes Atlanta. which changes the tone of the war.
During this time, the Democrats are running against him, and the Democrats are like, "Hey, everyone, if you're tired of this war, vote us in, and then we'll have peace with the South, and all be well." And you have to hear that and be like, "Wow, that'd be a pretty compelling pitch." After years and years of war. So and if you can imagine, if he loses that race, and the Democrats are like, "Hey, we're in like peace with the South," there is no United States of America as we know it today.
Everything changes. That's the thing. I mean, he believes that that you have to win on the battlefield and in the election for his vision of a magnanimous peace to work. The book is about how you win a peace, right? The book is about Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war and his vision for national reconciliation and reunification. And what is so extraordinary is he comes up with this without any historic precedent, because there's never been a civil war on that scale before. He comes up with a basic formula that you indicated: unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. And there were people in his time saying, look, we've lost 750,000 Americans, that let's just have peace. Let's have a ceasefire. He gets brought ceasefire offers from the Confederates on at least 2 occasions, and he refuses them. Easy political win, right?
Yeah, no, he would say the war's over and we won. Like, you feel like 9 out of 10 political leaders would take that.
Yeah, and they would be wrong, because what Lincoln understood was that the political will to end slavery would evaporate.
Yes.
If there was a ceasefire before surrender, which is why he'd refuse. He said, "No one man desires peace more than I, but I'm unwilling to accept a peace on such terms that would guarantee the next war. If you don't remove the root cause of the war, it's not peace." And so a just war must be followed by a just peace, but you need to end the fundamental underlying issue, which is slavery, and also the idea that states have a right to secede. And so that's why an unconditional surrender needed to precede a magnanimous peace. But even in that, there were people in his own party who want vengeance.
Yeah.
And he's saying, no, that's not the way. We need to build our enemies back up. And we need to, have political reform, economic expansion, move the nation's attention westward, and then cultural reintegration, which will take time, moving toward a multiracial and majoritarian democracy, which is the thing had been fundamentally resisted. But he is so farsighted, and where the book, we may get there in the conversation, but where the book ends up going is that his vision ends up being vindicated in the wake of the Second World War, where we pursue a policy of unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace, and it works.
Well, some of the signs of the fact that he did want a magnanimous peace is when he talks about letting the Confederate president essentially leave the country. You'd be like, well, hopefully someone can just make sure he gets out, because he doesn't want to execute him, but he also obviously can't just have him hanging around. And he tells his generals to let him up easy, let everyone go home, let them keep their horses, just want to have to give them back to their families, which would be a very tough stance to hold on to after years and years of conflict, and then people all telling you that after you win, we have to punish the treasonous rebels. So he presides over the end of a war that he had opportunities to end earlier, but not unconditionally. And so he's like, look, we need an unconditional surrender. Eventually, Robert E. Lee does capitulate and surrenders. And unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated very, very shortly thereafter. It seems like there's no real opportunity even to celebrate the end of the war before people are cast into mourning.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And the magnanimous peace that Lincoln had been evangelizing for, that seemed to be carrying the day. I mean, he's assassinated 5 days after Lee surrendered Appomattox, the generous terms of which that Grant writes are basically terms that he had received from Lincoln in their detailed meetings. But, one of the things that happened is that feeling of magnanimity, of we must reunite the nation, is immediately replaced by a feeling of revenge. So Lincoln's martyrdom helps solidify the Union in some respect, but it also gets us back, ironically, off. It harms his legacy, because we get off a path of magnanimity towards one of vengeance, Andrew Johnson is the worst possible person to take over for him. And where Lincoln had wanted the rank and file amnesty, let them, have their guns to shoot crows with and their horses to plow with. He as you said, he wasn't going to make a martyr of Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership by hanging them, which is the traditional punishment for treason. But he also wasn't going to let the planter class, the people who should have known better, the members of Congress, the courts, the military, who joined the Confederacy, he wasn't going to give them amnesty right away. He wasn't going to let them get their power back, because he knew that would end up being a restoration of the slave class, even in the absence of slavery itself, due to the 13th Amendment, which he passed before he died. Which is a reminder, by the way, that even if rights are enshrined in the Constitution, they don't mean anything if they're not enforced. But it just gets us off on precisely the wrong path and the opposite of what Lincoln wanted. But one of the things he did understand: you want magnanimity, but you still need accountability for leadership to precede reconciliation.
So he's succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who seems positively Trumpian in the description.
Yes,
he's like aggrieved, like all about him, like a bit of an alcoholic, it seems. I did not realize just what a terrible president Andrew Johnson was. I don't think. And as a result, then there is something of a restoration of the Southern elite, and they implement the Black codes, codifying various ways to make Blacks second-class citizens in the South. It probably contributes to the rise of the KKK, which then President Grant is left to stamp out when he becomes president a few years later.
Yeah, it's a really resonant story. I think actually the story of Reconstruction is one that our country needs to focus on a lot more for a bunch of different reasons. You're right about Johnson in particular. I was struck by a article about Johnson at the time in the Atlantic Monthly, which called him egotistic to the point of mental disease, vain. And
there were a number of lines that reminded me of Trump in the description.
Yeah,
I was this feels familiar.
It's the old Mark Twain line: history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. But you're right. Grant gets us back on the Lincoln path. He'd heard Lincoln's vision for how to win a peace consistently. And the most important thing he does as a president, I would argue, is when he goes to Congress personally to lobby for the passage of the Anti-KKK Enforcement Act, and then has that act enforced by a Southern Attorney General. So it makes it impossible or more difficult for the members of the KKK to say they're suffering at the hands of Yankee imperialism, or the Southern version of that. And again, they hold the leadership accountable, send them to prison up in Albany, and it works. I mean, the first incarnation of the KKK is cut away. But its goal was obviously to take advantage of a vacuum, to use voter intimidation, violence, to reassert white supremacy in the South, and snuff out that early incidents of Black leadership in the Republican Party in the South. And it's no small irony to me that the Anti-KKK Enforcement Act is being cited in some of the cases around both Charlottesville trial that's occurred and January 6th. That a lot of the laws that were put in place by the Civil War generation to deal with insurrection are now being dusted off, and indeed were intended to be not simply backward-looking, but forward-looking. But it's a reminder that we cannot take our gains for granted. One of the stats that's so chilling to me is that in 1900, because this took decades to take place, Confederates sitting on the courts and deprioritization of racial reconciliation. That in 1900, Alabama had 180,000 registered Black voters. 3 years later, it had 3,000. It's just chilling, and it's a reminder we cannot take our gains for granted.
You start writing this book 4 years ago. Were you concerned about the possible disintegration of the country into like some new civil war at that point? And you were writing about bringing the country back together in 2004. Polarization has gotten so much worse since then. Your book, Washington's Farewell, is in large part about his warning against hyperpartisanship.
Yeah.
I mean, this book felt very, very relevant in 2022. You know, so were you concerned about some of the things we're seeing today in 2018 when you were even considering this book?
Sure. It's a reason that we should not only be wary, but actively resist tribal politics. We've seen how dangerous that is over and over again. And, you know, all my work, all my columns, but certainly all my books are in different ways about the core issue of defending democracy, overcoming hyperpartisanship and polarization, because I think that's the core problem facing us. And how to making a case for how to do that, particularly through the creation of a vital center and the leaders who've exemplified that from our past. You know, my book in 2010 was called Wingnuts, about, you know, how the lunatic fringe is hijacking America. That was a different approach. That was playing offense from the center, but saying, look at the extremes, look at the interplay of the extremes. When you hear, you know, Glenn Beck, you got to, at the time, you need to understand the John Birch Society. Here's the history of this stuff. So this is stuff that I've written about for a long time, but this is, I think,
it's fun how you're attacking it from different angles, man, but continue.
Yeah. No, that's exactly, it's very intentional, you know, 100%. And part of the reason I went to history isn't only because I love history and I like writing, you know, sort of the tactile literary history that I like to read. You know, you should always try to write the books you want to read. But that we can talk about politics through the prism of our history, and it gives us perspective on our problems and our politics. It's less polarizing. Whereas if I, you know, and hopefully you could reach different people by reminding them that actually, especially around the Tea Party, when people tried to misappropriate the founding fathers' legacies to their own ideological and political ends. And then you say, no, let's look at what actually Washington's political last will and testament warned us against this, exactly this polarization. We need to focus on national unity and political moderation. And then Lincoln, you know, 80 years later is defending our democracy, as he had said as a young man, as a nation of free men, we must live for all time or die by suicide. And he was dealing with the thing the founding fathers feared. And he was able to summon the right kind of leadership to help us survive. And that's part of the hopeful thing about studying the Civil War, is that we've been through far worse before. You know, we need to have courage, and we need to stop feeling so precious, and that we'll get over this. We'll get through this, but it's not going to simply happen on its own, particularly if we allow these larger forces to continue to divide us when it doesn't actually represent our true character as a nation. And that's one of the things that I think Lincoln's leadership, in addition to the example of reconciling leadership, which he basically invents, can do for us today.
So he winds up with Vice President Andrew Johnson, who ends up taking over and being a really subpar president, in part as like a political compromise / unity ticket. Mm-hmm. And there was part of me that really applauded it when you first read about it. You're like, oh yeah, unity ticket. Like he got in a Democrat as his, you know, I mean, think about that, everyone. Republican president, vice president, who's a Democrat. It's like, oh, you know, there they are. But then it ends up biting the country in the ass when, you know, yep, like Andrew Johnson winds up becoming president. So that was one thing that, I mean, there were so many ingredients of this where I was like, wow, like unity ticket, third party candidate, like things that most Americans now today would find inconceivable.
Well, you know, it's one of the reasons I'm loving talking to you about this book and giving you the book is that there's so many things that I wrote very intentionally that, you know, won't resonate the same way with everybody. But, you know, that was, you know, that was 100% one of the reasons why I focused on these things that get short shrift. Lincoln runs for re-election on a national unity ticket. It's the National Union Party, which makes a ton of sense during Civil War. And then also the fact that he ditches his vice president, you know, who's from Maine. Think about it, at the time the Republican Party is trying to bridge the West and the Northeast, right? So, but Hamlin's not really particularly involved in the war, and he's like
hanging out in Maine.
Yeah, he just hangs out in Maine. The vice presidents did not have a very defined role. But then he says, look, you know, Andrew Johnson is the only Southerner in the Senate who refuses to secede with his state. And he's gotten rid of his slaves. And I want to show that we can have a national unity ticket. We're going to rebrand the Republican Party, and it'll be a North-South balance, Republican and Democrat, giving war Democrats permission to vote for this Republican ticket. And it's appropriate to a time of civil war. It's inspired. It's not only politically inspired, it's sort of, it is inspired. But I think it becomes a cautionary tale, which is one of the reasons it hasn't happened before, because of the question of character. There's never been a president assassinated before Abraham Lincoln. So he might, even though he's gotten death threats throughout the war, he might have not been adequately thinking of it. He may have placed too much emphasis on the fact they knew each other as young men in his one term in Congress. When Johnson shows up drunk to inauguration, Lincoln's pretty pissed and knows he's made a big mistake. But even the radical Republicans thought that Johnson would be a bigger ally than Lincoln. In fact, one of them, Benjamin Wade, said before Lincoln was assassinated, we hope that, he said to Johnson, sometimes I hope that Lincoln will be assassinated so you can lead us through Reconstruction, because they thought Johnson would be more vengeful. What they didn't adequately appreciate is that Johnson wasn't a race warrior. He was a class warrior. He was driven by resentment towards the planter class. He was actually incredibly bigoted. And he did everything he could to block the progress towards equal rights with a really vicious venom driven by his own resentments and insecurities and grievances. So I think one of the reasons we haven't seen that is because this particular example blew up so badly in the country's face, as you say, that it provides a cautionary tale. If the character of Johnson had been better, if that were conceivably happen in the future time, it does not need to end the same way, as long as the character of the people involved are solid and they share true goals and values.
In recent times, the closest we've come to it was the rumored pick of Joe Lieberman to be John McCain's running mate, which apparently was a fairly serious consideration. Now he,
I can give want to have a little scoopage on that.
Oh no, please,
I'll give you some news on that. So I was there when that was being pushed and floated. So as some of y'all might know, my political history is, I'm always an independent. I'm a centrist. I'm inspired by Bill Clinton's campaign for the presidency, the DLC recentering of the Democratic Party, and work on his 96 reelection, and very, very low level. And then Rudy Giuliani's running for reelection in New York, and he is a centrist sort of third way Republican. Urban republicanism. Peter Beinart did a great cover story for the New Republic called "The New Progressives" about all these third way mayors, and some were Dick Riordan in L.A. Republican, Rudy Republican. Some were Democrats like Michael White in Cleveland, Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis Republican, and it was exciting. So I worked for Rudy's reelection as an advance man, and then ended up becoming his chief speechwriter before 9/11 and through 9/11 at the age of like 27, 28. Rudy runs for president in 08, and I go back briefly. I met my wife, and Rudy was a very different guy than he is now. In any case, so I'm there when McCain, who's his friend, is calling around gauging whether it'd be support for Lieberman. And I happened to be with him, and he was having Lindsey Graham called in. And some people were freaking out because for them, the partisanship was the most important thing, or the ideology. And it got sort of squelched because their feeling is there'd be a revolt because the right wing didn't like, McCain enough to begin with, despite the fact that he was pretty conservative. He was too much of an iconoclast, a maverick. So that was a brief glimpse of what might have been, but basically the party apparatus would never allow that, which is part of the problem in our politics, right? It's why there is a need to break up the polarization.
So McCain got the opposite of the go-ahead sign from the party.
Rudy didn't think it'd be a bad idea in particular, as I recall, but the people around him, people were, there's a partisan economy that people underestimate in the most cynical economic sense.
Yeah,
people make money off polarization and party politics. It's a big business, and it totally twists people's minds, and they come up with all sorts of ornate excuses to rationalize it. But if you go outside, if the party nominee picks somebody outside their party, it short circuits everything. And I think, you can argue that maybe the Johnson-Lincoln example is a reason for it, but I guarantee you not any of them were thinking about that.
Oh, no. I mean, most of them probably aren't even aware of it. Plus, I mean, the problem there wasn't the unity thing. It's just that Andrew Johnson was the wrong guy. You know what I mean? Like you said, it's like if there's like a character problem. I don't know Joe Lieberman well, but he seems like a fine human.
You can agree or disagree, but that's not his issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are any number of high character Republicans that I think a lot of Democrats could look up and be like, do I love Mitt Romney? Like, maybe not. Like, do I think Mitt Romney's a moral human? Like, I mean, I happen to think Mitt Romney's
Yeah, I
a
agree.
very moral guy. And so, like that would be the litmus test. But I agree with you that there are very powerful incentives that keep you in one camp or another. I'll tell you a small story as a sign of this. So I start the Forward Party, good times, and then even going to law firms and tech providers, they actually specialize in either one party or the other. And so then if you were a third party, they're like, well, we can't deal with you because then like our one party might be super mad at us, and that's where all of our bread is buttered.
Yep. Yep. No, and you see this over and over again. These attempts to reinforce conformity. It's one of the reasons why, the people at the Lincoln Project, who stood up, the Republicans who stood up against Donald Trump showed extraordinary courage,
Yeah.
um, because all the economic pressures, the political pressures, the social pressures that created the sense of conformity that would thereby allow people to twist what they allegedly believed in or abandon what they allegedly believed in solely for the sake of party unity or access to power or profit. These people didn't do that. And whatever you think about whether you agree or disagree with their politics, I think one of the things that I've talked about is to some extent like defending democracy against demagoguery is a single issue litmus test, right? You're either in favor of democracy or you're going to find excuses for people who try to overturn democracy, and that is that's a very dangerous moment we are as a country. But the fact that the two parties ignore the fact that a plurality of Americans are self-identified independents, that number has doubled over the last 30 years, that they find ornate ways to ignore or excuse it or say it's not really a thing. They find ways to ignore the center of their own parties. I mean, in a rational political universe, Charlie Baker or Larry Hogan would be the most logical people in the world to run for president because they're blue state Republicans with 70% approval ratings. They don't even get looked at, thought about in any short list of Republicans insiders because they commit the sin of being pro-choice or not radical enough on other issues. It fundamentally distorts our ability to think and reason together. And the rot is in the political extremes and their influence on the political establishment to the extent where there's now no difference between the two. And I think Trump really exposed that for a lot of people. But you're exactly right. The partisan economy makes cowards of people.
Yeah, all of the market incentives drive in one direction. I talked to a guy named Miles Taylor the other
Yeah,
day.
sure.
Do you know Miles? He's
I not well
anonymous.
personally, but I know of him certainly.
Well, yeah. So he shared his story about uh, leaving Trump world, and he got attacked for what seems to me to be a clear act of patriotism and principle. Like you think somehow you get rewarded for for doing the right thing, and instead it's actually you get the rug pulled out from under you 9 times out of 10 and get accused of really nefarious motives. And so Miles and I had a laugh about it where he was like, like all of my economic incentives were to do the opposite of what I did.
Yep. Yep. And I'm working on a piece right now that'll be, called, how Ukraine broke the cult of Trump. And I was very resistant to call Trumpism a cult.
Wait! You were writing a new book? Sorry, is this like
no,
a
no,
scoop?
no, 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 no? It's going to be a column. It's going to be an essay.
A column. Okay. Okay.
But here's the point. Steve Hassan and other people, and I did this digital series on CNN called Reality Check. And I've been focusing on extremism. And one of the things I've shown over and over again, interviewing people who've left cults, first of all, that the way to get people out of a cult is through empathy, the exact process that you and I've talked about. You need to separate them from the day-to-day ecosystem, listen non-judgmentally, don't attack their belief system, have them talk about their values that they believe they back up, and then have them realize on their own, through usually a third-party example, that there is the people they've been following have not been living up to the values that they hold dear. And the problem with this process is it's not particularly scalable. There's another thing that cults do, which is they disproportionately punish heretics. They make examples for people who leave the cult. Why? The reason is because that's the only way to reinforce group cohesion through fear and greed. But also because the people who leave the cult are the people who are most dangerous to the cult. because they have credibility with the other members. So the other members have to be taught that this person is to be shunned and cast out, that there is something shameful about them. That dynamic is almost written into human nature. It goes back centuries when you study cults or any of these groups. And that's why the people who break away and start speaking their truth need to be held up, because they're speaking their truth. But they're so threatening to the group cohesion. And sometimes that group cohesion itself is cynical, because it's really just based upon a foundation of fear and greed. But those impulses can be extraordinarily powerful. So long way of saying those are the people you want to hold up and admire.
Yeah, one of the great mysteries to me is why more moderate Democrats haven't gotten behind the Liz Cheneys and Adam Kinzingers of the world, who are like the principled Republicans who voted for impeachment. And it's just because there's an R next to them. Peter Meyer. It's like some of these people have literally had threats against their lives, and they're trying to do the right thing. And instead of being elevated and supported in the way you're describing, they're kind of like left out to kind of bear the brunt of what's going on with their own party.
So it's interesting. I bet, like McCain at the end of his life, Kinzinger certainly, and again, it's a good example of this. The only issue that ultimately matters is whether you're willing to defend democracy. These people are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
At the most difficult and critical time, and it's not a question of who will look good in the eyes of history. Like, I'll tell you right now, that's not a tough call. Kinzingers and Cheneys are absolutely heroes because of what they're doing. And whether you agree with their politics on policy level or not, it's really irrelevant. What I think you'll find is their donations and their public support is probably much higher among Democrats than you'd expect, maybe even 50-50, and their support among Republicans has decreased. The problem is that that's a political vulnerability, particularly in redistricting. And this gets to the heart of what I think you're getting at. Instead of when Republicans in Democratic state, when Democrats in states like Illinois, which are Democratic states, are doing redistricting, or New York, you'd probably, if you were thinking for the good of the country, is not try to screw Adam Kinzinger or John Katko. Go for, if you want to make someone's district more difficult, take somebody who, like an Elise Stefanik, I'll use as an example. And make their district slightly more democratic, so they actually have an incentive to try to reach out and not simply play to the base. And instead, what they did is they exerted political pressure on Kinzinger and Katko even before the maps were completed, so they just decided not to run again.
Yeah, which is a huge loss, in my opinion.
It's a huge loss. It's so short-sighted. It's actually very cynical, because it reinforces this sort of moral equivalence, and it is. I hope they stay active in politics, in particular Kinzinger. I'm fairly confident he will in some way, and he certainly should. Those people who had the courage to stand up. I mean, if an attempt to overturn an election on the basis of a lie and an attack on our capital isn't clarifying to you, what the hell is? And I think that's what's, I think, truly troubling about our times.
I'm going to share a personal story, John, that I'm not sure
Please.
I've shared. I left the Democratic Party on October 4th, and I was stunned at how mad people seemed. Like I didn't think it was going to be that much of a deal. Like I kind of, I filed the paperwork and was like, if I'm starting the Forward Party, I should break up with the Democratic Party. And then I was like, okay, I'll post a social media video, I'll write a blog post, and I'll put those out in the world like the day before the Forward Party gets announced. And wow, was that like much more of a topic for discussion, and like being accused of all sorts of very negative things. And I was like, whoa, guys. And part of me was a little bit like, hey guys, like, I'm still the same person, an American, like, I haven't suddenly become a different person. Though two things did happen after that. Like, one was like the venom that was directed towards me, like as a human being, you do notice it. You're like, huh, like that seems a little much for someone who like I think is in like demonstrated goodwill towards most people and like, trying to make positive things happen for the country. But the second thing that happened too is that I didn't realize myself how just taking off a party hat actually does influence your thinking. Like I thought that as someone who'd been a Democrat for 20 plus years, I was like thinking very much for myself that whole time. But I will say that like just taking that piece of paper and filing it and saying independent, like all of a sudden my take on things did shift, in part because when Democrats were saying and doing things, I didn't associate myself with them necessarily. Like it wasn't necessarily my team anymore. And so you'd actually interpret actions and statements differently.
I think it's such a profound point. I mean, what surprised you? Was it that you feel that people felt betrayed because you'd run for office as a Democrat, or your base was maybe more self-identified progressive than it seemed? Because you're, to your point, you're the same person. You always have fundamentally uniting rhetoric, and you've always talked about reforming a system in a way that's beyond partisan politics. That's never been your lens. So what did that come from? Just a tribal sense of betrayal, or what?
Well, I think if you're trained to see the world as black and white or good and bad, and then if someone takes off the team jersey, then you're just going to think that they're joining the other team because you can't imagine a world where there aren't just two teams. And so those were the primary accusations I seemed to get, John. It was like, you're going to be a Republican, next week, or you're a narcissist. You're like doing it. And I thought to myself, it's like, again, this stuff, like no one declares political independence as a path to, glory and power.
No, it's the exact opposite, right? People make compromises in pursuit of power by joining a team, and then all of a sudden, if you see quickly, it becomes party over country.
It was very surprising. Like I looked at it, it was very hard not to be struck by it. But it speaks to what you were saying before, is that there are these false economies, and one way they maintain cohesion is by casting out anyone who like kind of publicly leaves or questions the orthodoxy.
Yeah, and I think Lincoln's example shows us that there are different ways to lead, and there have been examples of successful third parties in the past in highly specific circumstances. And one of the things you've said about the Forward Party, and I happen to agree with the principles you have, particularly around redistricting reform, open primaries, and ranked choice voting. Because I think you need to change the incentive structures around our politics, and then you'll have a politics that actually rewards problem solving and reflects our real values as a country and our underlying character. Is that you don't necessarily need to leave your party to associate with Forward. One of the things that fascinates me is the way that the parties try to diminish that simple declaration of independence, not only by closing off political pathways superficially, despite the fact that most 85% of mayoralty in the country are open or nonpartisan primary elections, open primaries, which is what it should be, particularly for that office. But the way they try to diminish independence by saying, you can't, in some states you can't be an independent. You're a declined to state. You're a blank, right?
Yeah.
They try to. The fundamental. We should all be thinking as the founding fathers wished. Way beyond party label, and the party labels can be helpful at certain times. I want to reiterate, we have asymmetric polarization right now. There's, I think it's important to understand the interplay between the extremes in people's psychology, but let's not kid ourselves about which party is more extremist when it comes to members of Congress and the incentive structures right now. But that pendulum could easily swing the other way over time. And you want to understand the loop. But if you care about actually breaking this cycle of vengeance and violence, which is what Lincoln was about, then you need to approach politics a different way. And you need to think about the politics, the golden rule. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. And that's the core value that Lincoln brought to his politics. That is the flow through. Because his politics don't neatly line up with ideologies today, certainly not with party labels. It's got nothing to do with that at all. So that's where I think Lincoln becomes a leader for reformers and reconcilers.
He truly was a leader for the ages, and reading your book made me appreciate it anew. I remembered some of it, but a lot of it was new. It's a really important work and incredibly relevant for today. My last question for you is actually something that you and I are sharing. So you're going to be hosting the Fair Vote Awards, first ever, on April 11th in New York. I'm going to be there. How the heck did you link up with Fair Vote? I get the sense that you also got there before I did, or before a lot of us, because you've been on this train for a while. And for those of you who don't know, Fair Vote is a nonprofit that has been championing ranked choice voting for years and years now.
Well, and election reform writ large. I mean, I've been writing about these issues as a columnist going back to when I began as a columnist in 2002. I was always an independent. I've never been a Republican, and I've always been really focused on these issues of political reform and open primaries and redistricting reform, because we want representative democracy. You have representative democracy, you get more representative results, and this, the way the system's been rigged by the extremes, you can see this coming. Everything flows from these fundamental problems we've been talking about: hyperpartisanship and polarization. So the people working to change the rules, to change the game, are people I've interviewed with. I've talked about the policies. I've talked about the history of the policies. Kurt Novoselic, the former bass player for Nirvana, actually was the honorary co-chair of Fair Vote for years, and had a great experience of seeing the movie Lincoln with him, actually, and his wife, and then going out for Guinness afterwards, which was a memorable night. But so, yeah, I've followed what Fair Vote and other associated groups have done, been a big supporter of their efforts, because I agree with it as a matter of principle. And one of the blessed things about being a columnist, particularly, before I was editor-in-chief and different roles I've played, you get to talk about what you care about. And one of my rules, I think, because I had a background in government, is I was always interested in, I want to focus on solutions, not just focus on problems.
Yep.
And so the people who are putting forward solutions, I want to highlight them and talk about them and elevate them. And Fair Vote's been doing that as early as anyone. So I'm looking forward to that. And you richly deserve to be on that dais with Catherine Murdoch and some other fun folks.
Yeah, we're going to have a great time that night. John Avlon, I've learned a lot from you. You are much further along this curve than just about anyone. And I feel like you're like this stealth voice of moderation and reason and reform all rolled into one. And most people don't even realize it because you're so good looking. Congratulations on Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. Such a great read, super relevant for today's era. And thank you, my friend, for being here. It's great sharing this time with you.
My friend, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And the last hour has been no exception. I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Yep. Have a great time with the family. I'll see you at the Fair Vote Awards at the latest.
You got it. All right, man. Be well.
Bye, John.